Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to the assembly lines of Detroit, 1942. The city is churning out bombers and tanks 24 hours a day. The factories never sleep. Neither do the men working them. Somewhere between the midnight shift and the morning whistle, in the dim corner of a break room that smells like motor oil and sweat and cigarettes, two men pass a thermos of coffee back and forth. Their fingers brush. They hold the touch a moment longer than necessary. Outside, the war rages. Inside, a different kind of courage is taking shape. The kind that has no medals, no parades, no place in the official record. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it was like to fall in love on a factory floor where 10,000 men worked elbow to elbow, but no one could know your secret? Have you ever wondered how two men found each other in the noise of punch presses and the smoke of arc welders? Have you ever wondered where they went when the shift ended and the city around them had no name for what they felt? Have you ever wondered what happened when the war ended and the factories slowed and the men who had lived double lives suddenly had nowhere left to hide? Have you ever thought about the auto worker who went home to a wife he did not love and wrote letters at night to the man on the line beside him, letters he never sent? Have you ever wondered who kept those letters after he died? Have you ever wondered if anyone, anywhere, remembers his name? Congratulations! You have just clocked in at the Willow Run Bomber Plant, January 1943. You are standing in the largest factory ever built under a single roof. 3.5 million square feet of American industrial might. It is loud enough to damage your hearing. It is cold enough that you can see your breath until the machines warm up the air. You are surrounded by men. Let us see if you can survive the shift. Good luck. The thing you need to understand about Detroit in the 1940s is that it was the center of the world. Not Paris, not London, not New York. Detroit. If you wanted to win the war, you came to Detroit. If you wanted a job, you came to Detroit. If you wanted to disappear into a sea of bodies and start over with a new name and a story no one would question, you came to Detroit. And if you were a young man from a small town where everyone knew your family and someone had started asking the wrong questions about why you were not married yet, you definitely came to Detroit. By 1943, the city had swelled from just under 2 million people to nearly 3 million. The factories were hiring anyone with a pulse. Ford's Willow Run plant alone employed 42,000 workers at its peak. The Packard plant, the Dodge Main, the Highland Park Ford complex, the River Rouge plant, Henry Ford's pride, the single largest factory in the world, where raw materials came in one end and finished cars rolled out the other. Every day, 10,000 men streamed through the gates. Most of them had never worked in a factory before. Farm boys, clerks, musicians, teachers, men running from something, men running towards something, men who had no idea what they were running toward until they saw him across the shop floor. George Chauncey, in his work on gay life in American cities, found that industrial centers during wartime became unexpected havens for queer men. The sheer density of bodies created a kind of protective anonymity. You could be anyone. You could become anyone. The factories did not care who you loved as long as you made your quota. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts. 6 days a week. Sometimes 7. You clocked in and the noise hit you like a physical thing. Metal on metal, pneumatic hammers, the endless shriek of drills. The floor vibrated under your boots. The air tasted like oil and ozone. You learned to read lips because shouting was useless. You learned to move without thinking because thinking meant losing a finger. Men lost fingers all the time, sometimes more. The pay was union scale, which meant decent by 1940 standards, about $1 an hour for most line work, enough to rent a room in a boarding house, enough to eat, enough to save a little if you were careful, enough to go out on Friday night and buy a drink, and maybe, if you knew where to go, meet someone. The trick was knowing where to go. Detroit had a geography, not the one in the official guidebooks, the one that lived in whispers, in glances, in the particular way a man leaned against a street lamp at the corner of Woodward and Montcalm at 11 at night. The Black Cat Bar on West Grand Boulevard. Ruby's Cafe on the edge of Greektown, where Ruby herself was known to turn a blind eye if two men sat a little too close in the back booth. The bathhouse on East Adams Street, which officially offered nothing more than a hot soak and a towel, but where certain rooms on the upper floors had locks that bolted from the inside. The cruising areas, Grand Circus Park after dark, the Cass Corridor, the stretch of riverfront behind the warehouses where cargo ships unloaded, and no one paid attention to men meeting in the shadows. You learned these places from other men, never written down, always passed along in code. A co-worker might mention he had a cousin who lived near Woodward and Montcalm. You understood the signal. Or he might tell you he knew a good place for coffee, real quiet, off the beaten path. You understood that too. The historian Alan Berube spent years documenting how World War II reshaped gay life in America. He found draft records, letters, oral histories from men who had lived through it. What he discovered was this: the war did not create gay people, but it gave them infrastructure. It pulled millions of young men out of their hometowns and dropped them into environments where normal life was suspended. Anything could happen. The rules were different. You were living in a city of strangers, working alongside men whose names you barely knew, sleeping in boarding houses where the landlord did not care what happened behind closed doors as long as the rent came on time. For the first time in your life, you were not being watched by your mother, your preacher, your neighbor who had known you since you were 6 years old. You were anonymous. And in that anonymity, you could breathe. The bomber plants ran 3 shifts: day, swing, graveyard. Most of the married men worked days. The young guys, the single guys, the men no one asked questions about, they took the late shifts. Swing shifts started at 4 in the afternoon and ran till midnight. Graveyard ran midnight to 8 in the morning. If you worked graveyard, you lived in a different world. You slept while the city worked. You woke when the city slept. Your social circle was other graveyard guys. Your bars were the ones that stayed open past 2. Your life was inverted, separate, operating on a frequency the daylight world could not hear. Perfect. Swing shift was the sweet spot. You clocked out at midnight, still had energy, still had the night ahead of you. The bars stayed open till 2. The bathhouse never closed. You could meet someone at 1 in the morning and still have time to go somewhere. A boarding house room, a parked car, the storage loft above the corner drugstore where your friend worked and said you could use the key as long as you did not make a mess. Most of the men worked as riveters, welders, or assemblers. Riveters worked in pairs, one man holding the bucking bar on one side of the aluminum skin, the other man driving the rivet gun on the other side. It was loud, hot, and required a particular rhythm. You had to trust your partner. You had to move in sync. You spent 12 hours a day 6 inches away from another man's body, reading his movements, responding to his cues. Some men requested the same partner every shift. Management allowed it. Productivity went up when teams stayed consistent. No one asked why some teams seemed particularly close. Welders worked alone mostly, crouched inside the fuselage or the wing assembly, wearing masks that made you invisible. You could be anyone under the mask. Some of the welders were women. Rosie the riveter was real, and she worked the lines at Willow Run and River Rouge. A few of the welders were men who had been rejected from the draft for medical reasons or because they had been classified 4F, which sometimes meant a heart murmur, sometimes meant flat feet, sometimes meant the draft board psychiatrist had decided you were, in his professional opinion, sexually deviant. They did not use the word homosexual. They used words like psychopathic personality or sexual perversion. It went in your file. You were rejected. You went home. And then you went to Detroit because what else were you going to do? The men classified 4F for homosexuality rarely talked about it. But they recognized each other, a certain carefulness, a certain way of not asking questions. You became friends without ever saying why you were both here. By 1943, nearly 18% of the workforce at the major Detroit plants was living in temporary housing, boarding houses, converted hotels, rented rooms, trailers, even tents in the summer. Most of the boarding houses were segregated by race, as was most of Detroit. Black workers from the South, who had come north for the same reasons as everyone else, were crammed into the already overcrowded Paradise Valley and Black Bottom neighborhoods, where rents were extortionate and conditions were abysmal. The city's racism was blatant, violent, and omnipresent. The same factories that hired anyone with a pulse kept separate bathrooms, separate cafeterias, separate water fountains. The same unions that fought for decent pay fought to keep black workers out of skilled positions. In June 1943, the tension erupted into race riots that left 34 people dead and hundreds injured. Federal troops had to be called in. The city burned for 3 days. This matters because the geography of gay Detroit was not separate from the geography of race. Black queer men had their own networks, their own meeting places, their own survival strategies. The house parties in Black Bottom, the after-hours clubs on Hastings Street where the music was live and the police did not come unless someone got shot. The rent parties where you paid a dime at the door and the host provided food and liquor and a place to dance. And if two men danced together, no one said a word because survival meant minding your business. White queer men and black queer men did not mix much in public because the danger was too great. A white man caught with a black man faced not just sodomy charges, but the additional accusation of race mixing, which could land you in prison or worse. A black man caught with a white man faced lynch law. It happened. The Detroit Tribune and the Michigan Chronicle documented cases of black men beaten or killed for being in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time, and if there was even a rumor of sexual deviance involved, the violence was worse. But on the factory floor, the lines blurred. You worked beside men of every background because the war did not care. The bomber had to be built. You passed tools, you shared cigarettes, you learned each other's names. Sometimes you learned more. One name that survives in the archives is James Arthur Riley, known as Jim. Born 1921 in Flint, Michigan. Moved to Detroit in early 1942. Hired at the Willow Run plant as a riveter in March of that year. We know his name because he was arrested in November 1944 and the court records were preserved. He was 23 years old. He had red hair and freckles. His arrest report lists his height as 5 feet 9 inches, his weight as 154 pounds. It lists his occupation as aircraft assembler. It lists his crime as gross indecency with another male person. The other male person was named Thomas Edward Klein, born 1919, from Kentucky. Worked the same line as Riley. They had been riveting partners for over a year. According to the arresting officer's report, filed with Wayne County Circuit Court and later preserved in the Michigan State Archives, the two men were discovered in a parked car on a side street near the factory at approximately 1:30 in the morning. The officer's report is graphic in the way these reports always were. Specific acts are described in clinical detail. Both men were taken into custody. Both were charged. Both pleaded guilty rather than face trial, which would have meant their names in the newspaper and their families finding out. Jim Riley was sentenced to 3 years probation. Tom Klein was sentenced to 90 days in the Detroit House of Correction. We do not know why the sentences were different. Maybe Klein had a prior arrest. Maybe the judge liked Riley's face. Maybe Riley's lawyer was better. The records do not say. What the records do say is that both men were immediately fired from Willow Run. Termination for moral turpitude. It went in their files. They would not work in a defense plant again. Jim Riley disappears from the records after 1945. He does not show up in city directories. He does not show up in census records. He might have changed his name. He might have left Michigan. He might have died. We do not know. Tom Klein shows up once more in the 1950 census, living in a boarding house in Cleveland. Occupation listed as dishwasher. He would have been 31. After that, he disappears too. They were two men among thousands. They were not special. They were not famous. They were simply trying to live. And they got caught. The arrest reports from Detroit during the 1940s are a strange kind of archive. They preserve hundreds of names we would never otherwise know. Men arrested for gross indecency, men arrested for solicitation, men arrested for lewd and lascivious behavior, which could mean anything from propositioning an undercover cop to standing too long in a public restroom. The charges were vague enough to be applied to almost any interaction. A hand on a shoulder, a look that lasted too long, an invitation for coffee that someone decided was something more. The Detroit police ran semi-regular sweeps of known cruising areas. An officer would stand in Grand Circus Park after dark, posing as a lonely cruiser. If a man approached and said the wrong thing, or even the right thing, he was arrested. If he resisted, he was beaten. If he was unlucky, his name ended up in the Detroit Free Press under the morals arrest section. A single sentence. Enough to destroy a life. The historian John D'Amelio documented these enforcement patterns across American cities. Detroit was no different from New York, San Francisco, or Los Angeles. The police targeted gay men as a matter of routine. Not because the men were dangerous, not because they were hurting anyone, but because the law said they were criminals, and the culture said they were perverts, and the police department had quotas to fill. The men learned to be careful. You never gave your real name on the first meeting. You never brought someone to your actual address. You never went to the same place 2 nights in a row. You developed codes, certain clothing choices, a red tie, a green handkerchief in the left pocket, certain phrases, asking if someone knew where the library was when there was no library nearby. You learned to read the crowd. You learned to spot the undercover cop by the way he stood, the way he made eye contact a little too eagerly, the new shoes that did not match his cheap coat. You learned to survive. Most of what we know about gay life in 1940s Detroit comes from 3 sources: arrest records, which preserve names but not stories; oral histories collected decades later by LGBTQ+ archivists interviewing the men who lived through it; and the letters that were hidden, saved, passed down, discovered in attics and estate sales and dusty boxes in the backs of closets. The letters are the most heartbreaking, because the letters were never meant to be read by anyone except the person they were written for. They were private. They were raw. They were love, in a time when love had to be hidden, encoded, whispered in the dark. One such letter survives in the collection of the LGBTQ+ archive at the University of Michigan. It is dated August 14th, 1943. It was written by a man named Paul to a man named Eddie. We do not have their last names. The letter was donated anonymously in 1987. The donor said it had been found in a box of belongings left behind when a great-uncle died. The great-uncle's name was Edward. The letter was tucked inside a copy of The Great Gatsby. The letter is written on thin blue paper in pencil. The handwriting is careful, almost childlike. It says, "Dear Eddie, I am writing this on my break, so I have to be quick. I have been thinking about Friday night. I have been thinking about it all week. I cannot stop thinking about it. I know we said we would be careful. I know we said we would not do this again. But I do not think I can keep that promise. I do not think I want to. When I see you on the line, I have to look away because if I do not, I will do something stupid. I want to do something stupid. I want to do it again. I hope you do too. If you do, leave the side door unlocked tonight. I will come by after my shift. If you do not want me to come, I will understand. But I hope you do. Yours, Paul." We do not know if Eddie left the door unlocked. We do not know if Paul came by. We do not know if they had 1 night or 100 nights. We do not know if they lived or died or moved away or grew old. All we know is that Paul wrote this letter on his break in a factory in Detroit in the middle of a war, and 79 years later, someone found it and decided it mattered enough to preserve. That is what this channel does. We find the Pauls and the Eddies. We say their names when we can. We hold space for them when we cannot. The work on the line was hard, but it was also weirdly intimate. You spent more time with your shift crew than you did with anyone else. You learned their rhythms. You knew who was fast and who was sloppy and who you could count on when the line sped up and the supervisor started shouting. You knew who brought extra food and shared it. You knew who told jokes to break the tension. You knew who kept his head down and never spoke unless spoken to. You knew who was safe. Safety was relative. Even in the crowd, even in the noise, you had to be careful. The guy next to you might be fine. The guy 2 stations down might be a plant. Some factories employed informants whose job was to report on worker organizing, union activity, anything that might slow production. The informants were told to report other things too. Communists, saboteurs, men who seemed a little too friendly with each other. It was safer to assume everyone was a threat until proven otherwise. But sometimes you met someone and the risk felt worth it. Maybe it was the way he looked at you when he handed you a tool. Maybe it was the way he laughed at your joke when no one else did. Maybe it was the way he lingered after the shift ended, lighting a cigarette slowly, waiting to see if you would walk out with him. Maybe you did. Maybe you walked a few blocks together in silence. Maybe he said he knew a place that served coffee this late. Maybe you went. Maybe nothing happened that first night except coffee and talk. Maybe you learned his real name. Maybe you told him yours. That was how it started. Slowly, carefully, testing the ground at every step. Because if you were wrong, if you misread the signals, if he turned out to be someone who would report you, well, you could lose your job, you could lose your housing, you could end up in jail, you could end up in the newspaper, you could end up beaten in an alley, you could end up dead. But if you were right, if the signals were real, if he felt the same thing, then maybe you had a chance. The factories operated around the clock, which meant the city around them operated around the clock too. Diners that never closed, all-night drugstores, bars that locked the front door at 2 a.m. but let the regulars in through the back till dawn. The Greyhound station, which was always full of transient men with duffel bags and tired faces, and where no one asked why you were waiting for a bus at 4 in the morning. The YMCA on Witherell Street, where a room cost 50 cents a night, and the desk clerk did not care if you signed the register with a fake name. Some men lived at the Y for months. It was cheap. It was anonymous. The rooms were tiny, just a bed, a chair, a shared bathroom down the hall. But privacy was privacy. You could lock the door. You could have a guest. As long as you were quiet and did not make trouble, no one bothered you. The Y had a cafeteria in the basement and a gym on the second floor. The gym was popular with factory workers who needed to stay strong for the line. You could shower after your workout. You could sit in the steam room. You could swim in the pool. Men walked around in towels. It was all very innocent, very wholesome, except for the moments when it was not. The YMCA has always had a complicated place in gay history. Officially, it was, and is, a Christian organization dedicated to building character and promoting healthy living. Unofficially, it became one of the most important social centers for gay men in early 20th century America, precisely because it was a place where men could be together without suspicion. You were just working out. You were just swimming. You were just staying in an affordable room. No one questioned it, until someone did. And then the YMCA would launch an internal investigation, fire a few staff members, ban a few regulars, and quietly continue operating the same way it always had. The Detroit Y on Witherell was raided twice during the 1940s, once in 1943 and again in 1947. Both times, several men were arrested for indecent behavior. Both times, the newspapers covered it with the kind of lurid detail that sold papers. Both times, the Y issued a statement expressing shock and pledging to increase supervision. And both times, within a few months, everything went back to normal. Because the reality was this: the city needed the Y. The factories needed the Y. Housing was scarce, and the Y provided cheap beds for thousands of transient workers. Closing it would have created a crisis. So the police made their arrests, the newspapers clutched their pearls, and the Y stayed open. The men who lived there learned to be more careful for a while. Then the heat died down, and life went on. The factory itself became a kind of sanctuary, which sounds absurd when you consider the conditions. The noise could damage your hearing permanently. The machines could take your hand off if you flinched at the wrong moment. The air was thick with metal dust and paint fumes and the particular chemical smell of solvents that made your eyes water. You worked 12-hour shifts in heat that reached 100 degrees in summer, cold that froze your fingers in winter. The bathrooms were filthy. The break rooms smelled like 3,000 men who had not showered. The floor was concrete, and by hour 10, your feet felt like someone had been hitting them with a hammer. And yet, for some men, it was the only place they could be themselves, or the closest thing to themselves they were allowed to be. Because on the factory floor, what mattered was whether you could do the job, not who you went home with, not what you did on Friday night, just whether you showed up on time, met your quota, and did not slow down the line. Competence brought you a kind of respect. If you were fast, if you were good, if the foreman knew he could count on you when the pressure was on, then he did not ask questions about your personal life. He did not care that you were 30 years old and unmarried. He did not care that you lived at the Y instead of renting a family apartment. He did not care that you never talked about girlfriends or mentioned going home for the holidays. He cared that Section E7 hit its targets, and you were part of the reason why. So you worked. You worked hard. You made yourself indispensable. And in the gaps between the work, in the moments when the foreman was not looking, you lived. A shared cigarette on the loading dock. A walk to the bus stop that took the long way around. A conversation in the break room that went 5 minutes longer than it needed to. An invitation to grab a beer after shift. These were not nothing. These were everything. One of the oral histories preserved by the Detroit Historical Society, collected in 1994 as part of a project documenting wartime industrial workers, includes an interview with a man identified only as Robert S. He was born in 1920. He worked at the Packard plant from 1941 to 1945. The interviewer asked him what he remembered most about those years. His answer was recorded on cassette tape and later transcribed. He said, "What I remember most is the guys. We were all so young. Most of us were just kids, really. 18, 19, 20 years old. We did not know what we were doing. We showed up and they handed us tools and said, 'Learn fast,' so we did. And in the process, we became close. You had to. You were depending on each other to not get killed. I had a riveting partner named Sam, skinny kid from West Virginia. Could not have weighed more than 130 pounds, but he was fast. Fastest bucker I ever worked with. We moved like one person after a while. I would think it, and he would do it. He would shift his position, and I would adjust mine without looking. It was like dancing, sort of. We got good, real good. The foreman used to bring visitors around to watch us work because we made it look easy. And after shift, we would go get food. Just the two of us most nights. We would sit in this diner on Gratiot and talk till 3 in the morning. About everything. About nothing. I told him things I had never told anyone. He told me things too. We were just kids. We did not have the words for what we were feeling. Hell, I am 74 years old, and I still do not have the words. All I know is I loved him. I never said it out loud. He never said it either. But I think he knew. I hope he knew." The interviewer asked what happened to Sam. Robert S. said Sam was drafted in late 1944 when the factory exemptions tightened. He shipped out in January 1945. He was killed in Germany in March, 3 weeks before the war in Europe ended. Robert S. received a letter from Sam's mother. She said she was writing to all of Sam's friends to let them know. She said Sam had mentioned Robert in his letters from basic training. She said Sam had called Robert his best friend. She enclosed a photograph. It showed Sam in his uniform. He was smiling. Robert S. said he kept the photograph for 49 years. He said he looked at it every night before bed. He said when his wife died in 1989, he finally allowed himself to put the photograph in a frame and set it on his dresser where he could see it first thing in the morning. He said he was not sure why he was telling the interviewer all this. He said he supposed it did not matter anymore. Everyone involved was dead except him. He said he just wanted someone to know. He said Sam was a good person. He said Sam deserved to be remembered. The interviewer thanked him. The tape ends. Robert S. died in 1996. He was 76. The photograph was found in his effects. It was donated to the Detroit Historical Society along with the tape. You can request to see it in their archives. Sam's full name is on the back of the photograph, written in pencil. Samuel Eugene Pritchard, born March 12, 1923, died March 19, 1945. He was 22 years old. He never got to grow old. He never got to come home and stand in the diner on Gratiot and have one more conversation. He never got to tell Robert S. what he felt or hear Robert say it back. He never got to sit on a porch somewhere in 1975 or 1985 or 1994 and laugh about the old days and the noise and the cold and how young they were. He went to war and he died, and the only reason we know his name at all is because Robert S. refused to forget him. That is the shape of gay history. Not monuments, not headlines. Just one man keeping a photograph for 49 years because he loved someone and had no other way to say it. The war changed everything, and the war changed nothing. It pulled men out of their small towns and showed them there were others like them. It gave them cities, crowds, anonymity, possibility. And then the war ended, and the cities wanted them to go home. The factories started laying people off. The government wanted the jobs back for the returning soldiers. Rosie the Riveter was sent home to make babies. The men who had come to Detroit for work, for escape, for a chance to breathe, they were suddenly expendable. By 1946, employment at Willow Run had dropped from 42,000 to fewer than 5,000. The bomber contracts were cancelled. The assembly lines went quiet. The plant that had been the largest building in the world sat mostly empty. Ford tried to repurpose it for car production, but it never worked the same. The wartime urgency was gone. The city that had swelled to 3 million started to contract. Some men went home, back to the small towns, back to the families, back to the lives they had left. Some of them got married, some of them went to church every Sunday and never spoke of Detroit again. Some of them spent the rest of their lives pretending those years had never happened, because that was what survival required. But some men stayed, because Detroit, for all its flaws, had given them something they could not find anywhere else. A place where they were not the only one. A network of friends who knew, bars that would serve them, boarding houses that would rent to them. Jobs that did not ask too many questions. It was not freedom, not by any modern standard, but it was more than they had before. The men who stayed built lives, quiet lives, careful lives. They worked factory jobs or warehouse jobs or service jobs. They rented rooms or small apartments. They had friends they called roommates. They went to the bars on Friday nights. They cruised the parks when the weather was warm. They went to the bathhouse when they needed to. They wrote letters they did not send. They fell in love in the spaces between things. Alan Berube argued that World War II did not just happen to gay people. It created the conditions for a gay community to emerge. Before the war, most queer people lived isolated, scattered, unaware that others existed. The war brought them together. Suddenly you were not alone. Suddenly there were dozens, hundreds, thousands of men who felt what you felt. You found each other in factories, on military bases, in port cities, in rooming houses. And after the war, you did not want to go back to being alone. That is how the modern gay rights movement started, not with a march or a manifesto, but with men who met during the war and decided they wanted to keep meeting. Men who rented apartments together and called themselves roommates but slept in the same bed. Men who opened bars and bathhouses and bookstores because they wanted spaces where they could be themselves. Men who started organizing, quietly at first, in living rooms and church basements and rented halls. The Mattachine Society was founded in 1950 by men who had lived through the war years. The homophile movement of the 1950s and 60s was built on the networks that formed in the 1940s. Detroit was part of that. Smaller than New York or San Francisco, less visible than Los Angeles or Chicago. But the networks were there. The Friday night poker games that were not really about poker. The theatre group that met above the bookstore on Woodward. The social club that called itself a veterans organisation, but whose members had all been classified 4F. The network of apartments where you could crash if you needed a place to stay, no questions asked. These networks saved lives. If you lost your job, someone knew a guy who was hiring. If you got arrested, someone knew a lawyer who would take the case quietly. If you got beaten up, someone would patch you up and not ask how it happened. If you needed to disappear for a while, someone had a cousin in Cleveland or Toledo or Chicago who would put you up. You survived because other people had survived, and they helped you survive, and you helped the next guy. That is community, not a parade, not a speech, just people taking care of each other because no one else would. The danger never went away. The raids continued through the 1950s and into the 60s. The police kept quotas. The newspapers kept publishing names. Men kept losing jobs, losing housing, losing families. The psychiatric establishment declared homosexuality a mental illness and offered treatments, electroshock, aversion therapy, lobotomy in extreme cases. The culture said you were sick. The law said you were criminal. The church said you were damned. And still, people loved. Still, people found each other. Still, people built lives in the margins. One more name from the archives. His name was Frank Kameny, born 1925, astronomer, worked for the Army Map Service in the 1950s. Fired in 1957 when a background check revealed he had been arrested in a park in California for lewd conduct. He fought the dismissal all the way to the Supreme Court. He lost. So he moved to Washington, D.C. and became one of the first gay rights activists in America. He picketed the White House. He fought the Civil Service Commission. He coined the slogan, "Gay is good," in 1968, 2 years before Stonewall. He lived long enough to see the psychiatric establishment remove homosexuality from the DSM in 1973. He lived long enough to see sodomy laws struck down in 2003. He lived long enough to see marriage equality in 2015. He died in 2011. He was 86 years old. Frank Kameny was not from Detroit, but he was part of the same generation, the men who had come of age during the war, the men who had tasted possibility and refused to go back, the men who decided that if the world would not make space for them, they would make space for themselves. The Autoworkers were part of that. Most of them never became activists. Most of them never marched or picketed or gave speeches. They just lived. They went to work. They came home. They loved who they loved. They survived. But survival is political. Living when the world tells you that you should not exist is resistance. Loving when the law says your love is criminal is resistance. Building a life in the face of a culture that wants you erased is resistance. The Autoworkers resisted. They did it quietly. They did it carefully. But they did it. The factories eventually closed or moved. The great auto plants of Detroit, Packard, Willow Run, Dodge, Maine, most of them are gone now. Demolished or abandoned. The Packard plant sits in ruins on East Grand Boulevard, 40 acres of crumbling concrete and broken glass. Urban explorers and photographers love it. It has become a symbol of Detroit's decline, of American industrial collapse, of the death of the manufacturing economy. But once, it was alive. Once, 10,000 men worked there. Once, the night shift clocked in at midnight and the lights burned till dawn. Once, 2 men met on the assembly line and fell in love, and no one wrote it down because no one thought it mattered. It mattered. It matters. We know some names. Jim Riley, Tom Klein, Robert S. Samuel Eugene Pritchard, Paul and Eddie, whose last names are lost, Frank Kameny, who fought back, hundreds of names from arrest records, men whose crime was being themselves, and thousands of names we will never know, men who left no letters, no photographs, no records, men who died and were buried under the wrong name, men whose families never knew, men whose partners could not attend the funeral, could not inherit the apartment, could not claim the body, men who were written out of obituaries, erased from family Bibles, forgotten by history. Tonight, we remember them. The assembly line at Willow Run moved at a crawl when they first started. It took 24 hours to assemble one B-24 bomber. The engineers and efficiency experts worked the bugs out. They sped it up. By 1944, they were producing one bomber every 63 minutes, a plane an hour, rolling off the line like cars. The fastest aircraft production rate in history. Each bomber required hundreds of workers: riveters, welders, electricians, painters, inspectors, mechanics. Every single one of them had to do their job correctly, or the plane would not fly. There was no room for error. A loose rivet could cause the fuselage to tear apart at altitude. A bad weld could mean the wing failed under stress. A crossed wire could mean the landing gear would not deploy. You trusted the guy next to you because you had to. His work affected your work. Your work affected the pilot who would fly the plane. The pilot's life depended on you doing your job right. That kind of pressure bonds people. You see someone at their best and their worst. You see them exhausted, frustrated, scared. You see them push through anyway. You develop respect, sometimes more than respect. The thing about love is that it happens anyway, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is dangerous, even when it makes no sense. You do not choose it, it chooses you. You are working next to someone day after day, and one day you realize you are watching for him when you clock in. You realize you are disappointed when he is not there. You realize you have started timing your breaks to match his. You realize you know how he takes his coffee. You realize you have memorized the shape of his hands, and maybe one day he catches you looking, and he does not look away, and something shifts. Maybe nothing happens for weeks after that. Maybe you are both too scared. Maybe you are both waiting for the other person to make the first move. Maybe you convince yourself you imagined it, and then maybe one night after shift he asks if you want to grab a bite, and you say yes, and you end up at a diner talking till the sun comes up. And somewhere in that conversation, maybe he tells you something real, something he has not told anyone else, and you tell him something back, and you realize you trust him, and maybe he realizes he trusts you. And maybe a week later he mentions he has a place, just a room, nothing fancy, but it is quiet. And maybe he says you are welcome to come by sometime if you want, just to talk, just to get away from the noise for a bit. And maybe you go, and maybe nothing happens that first time except talking. And maybe the second time, something does. That is how it happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just two people slowly realizing they did not have to be alone. The risks were constant. Every time you met, you were rolling the dice. Every time you touched, you were breaking the law. Every time you said something true, you were trusting that the other person would not use it against you. Most of the time, that trust was honored. Most of the time, the men who found each other protected each other. Because they were in it together. Because betrayal meant destroying yourself along with the other person. Because the stakes were too high for games. But sometimes trust was broken. Sometimes a man got scared and talked. Sometimes a man got angry after a breakup and went to the police. Sometimes a man was arrested and gave up names to save himself. It happened. Not often, but enough. Enough that you could never be completely sure. Enough that paranoia was a survival skill. The men who lasted, who built relationships that survived years, decades, were the ones who figured out how to manage the fear without letting it consume them. They developed rules. They kept separate social circles. They did not introduce their partners to their families. They maintained plausible deniability at all times. If questioned, they were roommates, cousins, army buddies splitting rent, just friends. Some men lived together for 40 years as roommates. When one died, the other had no legal claim to anything. The family would come in, take the belongings, sell the house. The surviving partner would be erased, sometimes literally. The family would go through and destroy any photographs, any letters, any evidence that their son or brother had lived with another man. The playwright Terence McNally wrote about this in his play, Love, Valor, Compassion. He based it on stories he had heard from older gay men who had lived through the pre-Stonewall era. Men who had lost everything when their partners died, because they had no legal standing. Men who had been denied the right to visit their dying partners in the hospital because they were not family. Men who had been thrown out of funerals by relatives who never acknowledged the relationship. That was the cost. You could build a life together, but it existed in the shadows. It had no legal protection. It had no social recognition. When it ended, and it always ended, because everyone dies eventually. The person left behind had nothing but memories. And yet people did it anyway, because love is not a cost-benefit analysis, because loneliness is worse than risk, because the human need for connection is stronger than the fear of loss. The auto workers in Detroit, the ones who found each other, who built something, who survived, they were brave in a way that is hard to explain to people who have never had to hide. They were brave every single day, every time they went to work, every time they smiled at someone, every time they said yes to coffee or a walk or come over sometime, every time they touched another person and trusted that touch would not be weaponized against them. They had no roadmap, no role models, no representation. The culture told them they did not exist, or if they did exist, they were sick, broken, evil. The movies showed no one like them. The books did not name them. The songs were not written for them. They had nothing except each other. And somehow, that was enough. The boarding houses were their own ecosystem. Most of them operated on the same basic model. A front desk that was sometimes staffed and sometimes not. A register you signed with whatever name you wanted. A shared bathroom on each floor. A communal kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. And rooms barely big enough for a bed and a chair. The walls were thin. You heard everything. Coughing, snoring, arguments, footsteps at 3 a.m, the rhythmic creak of bed springs, life pressed close against life. Privacy was theoretical, which meant you learned to be quiet. You learned to muffle sounds. You learned which floorboards squeaked and how to step around them. You learned to wait until the hall was empty before moving from one room to another. You learned to leave separately in the morning so the landlady did not see two men coming from the same door. Most landladies did not care as long as the rent came on time and no one caused trouble. Trouble meant fights, loud noise, police visits, anything that drew attention. Anything that drew attention was bad for business. So the unspoken rule was, do what you want behind closed doors, but keep it behind closed doors. Some boarding houses became known as safe places. The landlady at the house on Martin Street was rumoured to be fine with it. The old man who ran the place on 2nd Avenue had a nephew who was that way, and he did not ask questions. The house on Willis had mostly factory workers, and the foreman lived there too, so everyone kept their mouths shut because nobody wanted workplace drama. You found these places through word of mouth. Someone would mention they were looking for a room, and someone else would say, try the place on Martin Street. Ask for Mrs. Kowalski. Tell her Eddie sent you. That was code. Eddie sent you meant you were safe. It meant Mrs. Kowalski would rent to you, even if you were clearly single and clearly not interested in the waitress at the diner who kept asking if you wanted company. Mrs. Kowalski was real. Her full name was Helen Kowalski, born in 1901 in Hamtramck, widowed in 1938, when her husband died in a factory accident at Dodge, Maine. She used the settlement money to buy a 3-story house on Martin Street and converted it into a boarding house with 12 rooms. She ran it until 1959, when she sold the property and moved to Florida. She died in 1967. We know about her because one of her tenants, a man named Lawrence Becker, mentioned her in his oral history interview recorded in 1988 as part of a project documenting LGBTQ+ life in Detroit. Lawrence Becker lived at Mrs. Kowalski's from 1943 to 1947. He said she knew. He said she never said anything directly, but she knew. He said she would bring up coffee and pastries on Sunday mornings and knock on the doors and say breakfast for the boys, and she would count the cups she brought. If 2 men were sharing a room, she brought 2 cups. She never commented. She just brought 2 cups. Lawrence said she protected her tenants. He said once a police officer came around asking questions about a man who had been arrested in the park, and the officer wanted to know if any of Mrs. Kowalski's tenants knew him. She said she did not discuss her tenants with anyone. She said it was a matter of privacy. The officer said he could come back with a warrant. She said if he came back with a warrant, she would call her lawyer. The officer left. He did not come back. Lawrence said Mrs. Kowalski probably saved his life. He said if the officer had pushed harder, if she had given names, he would have been questioned, maybe arrested, definitely fired. He said she did not have to protect him. She chose to. He said he thought about her for the rest of his life. He said when he got the news she had died, he cried. He said she was one of the good ones. There were others like her. Not many, but some. People who saw what was happening, and decided to help instead of hurt. Bartenders who watered down the drinks but did not water down the welcome. Doctors who treated the injuries without asking how you got them. Lawyers who took the cases quietly, off the books, for whatever you could afford. Priests, yes, priests, who heard confessions and offered no condemnation, just compassion. Father Edmund Burke was one. He served at Most Holy Trinity Church in Corktown from 1938 to 1952. He was known among certain communities as someone you could talk to. He did not perform commitment ceremonies, that would have been too dangerous, but he did offer private blessings. He did offer counsel. He did offer a place to sit and be heard without judgment. We know about him because he is mentioned in the private papers of a man named Henry Gerber, who was one of the earliest gay rights activists in America. Gerber founded the Society for Human Rights in Chicago in 1924, the first documented gay rights organization in the United States. It lasted a few months before the police raided it and arrested everyone involved. Gerber spent the rest of his life writing letters, documenting gay history, corresponding with people across the country who were trying to do the same work. In a letter dated 1949, preserved in the Gerber Hart Library in Chicago, he mentions visiting Detroit and being introduced to Father Burke. He describes Burke as a rare man of genuine Christian charity. He says Burke understood that love was not a sin, no matter what the Vatican said. Father Burke died in 1954. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press described him as a devoted servant of the church who ministered to the poor and marginalized. It did not mention his ministry to queer people. That ministry was invisible by design, but it was real. The men he helped remembered him. The factories ran on shifts, but the social world ran on nights. Friday and Saturday were the big nights, but any night could work if you knew where to go. The bars opened at 8 or 9 and stayed open till 2. Some of them had back rooms that stayed open later. Some of them had basements. Some of them were just bars. Nothing special, nothing marked. But if you knew, you knew. The Brass Rail on Congress Street was one. It catered to an auto industry crowd. The bartender was a man named Vic, who had worked at Ford before the war and still had friends on the line. He poured heavy. He kept the lights low. He did not tolerate troublemakers, and he did not tolerate anyone who made his regulars uncomfortable. If you started a fight, you were banned. If you came in looking to cause problems, you were thrown out before you finished your first drink. The Brass Rail was not exclusively gay. It could not be, not if it wanted to stay open. But it was known as a place where you could relax. You could talk to the guy next to you at the bar without someone assuming you were trying to pick up his girlfriend. You could sit in the corner booth with someone and no one would bother you. You could dance if the jukebox was playing, and no one would say anything if two men danced together, as long as they were not too obvious about it. Obvious was the line. You could exist, but you could not flaunt. You could be affectionate, but not too affectionate. You could joke, but not too loudly. You navigated it by feel, by reading the room, by knowing when to pull back. The men who went to the Brass Rail developed a kind of etiquette. You did not out anyone. You did not use real names in public. You did not gossip about who left with whom. You did not bring outsiders unless they were vouched for. You did not take photographs. These rules were never written down, but everyone understood them. Breaking the rules meant you were not welcome back. The bar raids happened, but they happened less at places like the Brass Rail because the owner paid off the cops. That was just part of doing business. Every month, an envelope changed hands. In exchange, the cops looked the other way. They did not raid. They did not hassle the patrons. They left the bar alone. Until the city changed police chiefs or the precinct captain got greedy or someone higher up decided to crack down for political reasons. Then the arrangement fell apart and the raid started again. The bar would get hit on a Friday night. Everyone inside would be arrested. Names would go in the paper. Lives would be destroyed. The bar would close for a few months. Then it would reopen under a new name with the same owner, and the whole cycle would start again. The men who frequented these places learned to have exit strategies. You always sat near a door. You always knew where the back exit was. You never had more than 2 drinks because you needed to stay sharp. You kept your ID on you, but you kept your real address private. Use a friend's address, use the WWII. Use anything but the place where you actually slept. If the cops raided, you gave them the fake address. By the time they figured it out, you had moved. Some men got caught anyway. The arrest records from Detroit's 2nd Precinct, preserved in the Walter P. Reuther Library at Wayne State University, show dozens of arrests from bars across the city during the 1940s. The charges were usually disorderly conduct or public indecency, even when the men were just sitting at a bar having a drink. The cops did not need real charges. They just needed an excuse. Most of the men pleaded guilty and paid the fine because going to trial meant publicity. $25 and you walked. If you fought it, your name ended up in the paper. The Detroit Times loved morals charges. They ran them on page 3 under a headline that said, "Degenerates arrested." Every name, every address, every detail. So you paid the $25. You lost your job anyway because your boss read the paper. You lost your room because your landlord read the paper. You started over somewhere else with a new name and a new story. Unless you could not start over. Unless the arrest went on your record and every job application asked if you had ever been convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude. Unless you were blacklisted from the factories, the warehouses, the shops. Unless you ended up washing dishes for $1 a day under the table because no one would hire you legally. That was the tightrope. One mistake, one bad night, one cop who decided to meet his quota, and your life was over. The historian Estelle Friedman documented the use of morals charges as a tool of social control in her work on sexual regulation in America. She found that arrests for public indecency, lewd conduct, and sodomy spiked during periods of economic anxiety and social change. The 1940s were both. Wartime disruption, massive migration, women in factories, social roles in flux. The authorities responded by cracking down on anything that felt like disorder. Gay men were easy targets. The crackdown intensified after the war. In 1947, the Detroit Police Department created a special morals squad dedicated to enforcing decency laws. They focused on bars, bathhouses, parks, and public restrooms. They used undercover officers. They used entrapment. They arrested hundreds of men over the next decade. The men fought back in small ways. They warned each other. They boycotted bars that cooperated with police. They raised money for legal fees. They developed networks of lawyers who would take the cases. They did not call it activism because the word did not exist yet in that context. They called it survival. One lawyer who took these cases was a man named George Mendelsohn. He practiced in Detroit from 1946 until his death in 1971. He was not gay himself. He was married, had 3 children, but he took cases no one else would touch. He defended men arrested in parks, bathhouses, bars. He won some cases. He lost more. But he kept taking them. We know about him because his son, David Mendelsohn, wrote about him in a memoir published in 2003. David wrote that his father never talked about those cases at home. He never explained why he took them. But David found the files after his father died. Boxes and boxes of case files, all neatly organized, all related to morals charges. David said his father had kept meticulous notes. He had tracked patterns. He had documented police misconduct, illegal searches, coerced confessions. He had built a case that the enforcement was discriminatory and unconstitutional. He never filed that case. He died before he could. But the files were preserved. David donated them to Wayne State University in 2005. They are available to researchers. They document hundreds of arrests across 2 decades. They name names, the men arrested, the cops who arrested them, the judges who sentenced them. They are a record of systematic persecution. They are also a record of resistance. Because every case George Mendelsohn took was a case where a man had a lawyer, had someone arguing for him, had someone saying this is unjust. Most of the men could not afford a real defense. Mendelsohn took payment in whatever they could manage. Sometimes money, sometimes nothing. He did it because he believed it was wrong. He did it because someone had to. His son wrote that after his father died, several older men came to the funeral. Men David had never met. They did not identify themselves. They just said your father was a good man. They said he helped us when no one else would. They said we wanted you to know. Then they left. David did not understand who they were until he found the files. Then he understood. His father had saved lives. Quietly. Without recognition. Just because it was the right thing to do. The factories themselves were not exempt from the crackdowns. In 1948, Ford Motor Company implemented a new security protocol. All employees were subject to background checks. All employees could be questioned about their personal lives. All employees could be fired for moral turpitude, which was never defined, but everyone understood what it meant. The policy was officially about preventing sabotage and communist infiltration. The Cold War was beginning. The Red Scare was ramping up. Companies were under pressure to prove their loyalty. But the policy was also used to purge gay workers. Men were called into the personnel office and questioned. Have you ever been arrested? Do you live alone? Why are you not married? Do you frequent certain establishments? The questions were designed to make you confess or slip up. If you said the wrong thing, you were fired. If you refused to answer, you were fired. There was no due process. There was no appeal. The United Auto Workers, the union that represented most factory workers, did not fight these firings. The UAW in the 1940s and 50s was focused on wages, hours, working conditions. They fought hard for those things. They won major victories, but they did not fight for gay workers. The union leadership was openly hostile. They saw gay men as a liability, a distraction, a source of embarrassment. Some locals actively cooperated with the firings. They provided names. They encouraged members to report suspicious behavior. There were exceptions. Some shop stewards quietly protected gay members. Some locals looked the other way. But officially, the union did not help. It would take decades before that changed. The first openly gay union organizer in Detroit was a man named Jeffrey Montgomery. He came out in 1977. He fought for anti-discrimination language in union contracts. He fought for domestic partner benefits. He fought for HIV/AIDS protections in the 1980s. He won some battles. He lost others. But he kept fighting. Jeffrey Montgomery is still alive. He founded the Triangle Foundation in 1991, which became one of Michigan's leading LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations. In interviews, he talks about the generation that came before him, the auto workers who lived in silence, the men who were purged from the factories. He says they made his work possible. He says they survived so he could fight. The river was another geography. The Detroit River separated the city from Canada. Windsor was right there across the water. You could see it. On a clear day, you could almost throw a stone and hit it. The river was less than a mile wide at most points. Windsor had different laws. Canada did not criminalize homosexuality the same way the United States did. It was not paradise. Gay men were still harassed, still arrested, still marginalized. But it was different. Less aggressive, less punitive. Some Detroit men crossed the river regularly. You could take the ferry or the tunnel. It cost a quarter. You could go over on a Friday night, go to a bar in Windsor, stay till closing, come back before dawn. No one asked why you were going to Canada. Tourism, shopping, visiting friends. Whatever story you told, they accepted it. The bars in Windsor were quieter, less policed. The Metropole on Ouellette Avenue, the Dominion House, the Chesterfield. They were not exclusively gay, but they were known. You could relax a little. You could dance a little more openly. You could kiss someone goodnight outside the bar without worrying that a cop was watching. Some men moved to Windsor permanently. They found work in the factories there. Windsor had auto plants too. Chrysler and Ford both had operations across the river. They lived in Canada and told their families they were working abroad. They sent money home. They visited occasionally, but they built their lives somewhere they could breathe. The border crossing created complications. If you were arrested in the United States and had a record, you could be denied entry to Canada. If you were arrested in Canada, the US could deny your return. Men who crossed regularly learned to be invisible. No trouble. No attention. Just a quiet trip across the river and back. During the 1950s, both countries tightened their borders. The US Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 explicitly barred entry to people with psychopathic personality, which immigration officials interpreted to include homosexuals. Canada passed similar laws. The border became harder to cross. The safe haven across the river became less safe. But in the 1940s, it was still possible. It was still an option. It was still a place you could go when Detroit felt too dangerous, too small, too suffocating. The men who crossed the river regularly talked about it like taking a breath. You went over, you exhaled, you remembered what it felt like to exist without constant fear. Then you came back, because your job was in Detroit, your friends were in Detroit, your life was in Detroit. But you had that memory. You had the knowledge that somewhere, even just a mile away, it was a little bit easier. The shift schedules created a particular kind of time. If you worked graveyard, midnight to 8, you finished when the rest of the city was just starting. You walked out into daylight that felt wrong, too bright, too loud. The streets were full of people heading to work while you were heading home to sleep. You existed on a different clock. Your breakfast was everyone else's dinner. Your evening was everyone else's dawn. This temporal displacement had benefits. The bars that catered to shift workers stayed open through the morning. The Anchor Bar on Fort Street served eggs and beer at 9 a.m. to men coming off graveyard shift. No one thought twice about day drinking when your day had just ended at sunrise. The bathhouse on East Adams had morning rates for factory workers. You could go in at 8:30, soak the factory grime off your body, sit in the steam room till you felt human again. The morning crowd was smaller, quieter, more familiar. You saw the same faces, the same welder from Packard, the same assembler from Dodge, Maine, the same guy whose name you never learned but who always nodded when you walked in. A community defined not by identity, but by schedule. Some friendships formed in these morning hours. You were tired, unguarded, less careful. You said things you might not say at night when you were sharper, more suspicious. The exhaustion created intimacy. You sat at the bar next to someone eating scrambled eggs in silence, and somehow that silence meant something. You did not need to talk. You just needed to not be alone. One oral history, recorded in 1999 by the Detroit LGBT Oral History Project, features a man named Carl Bittner. He worked at the River Rouge plant from 1943 to 1968. He was born in 1924. He was 75 when the interview was recorded. He said the morning shift crowd at the Anchor Bar was the closest thing to family he ever had. He said, "We did not talk much. That was not the point. The point was, we were all there. You finished your shift, you walked the 3 blocks to the Anchor, you sat at the bar, you ate breakfast. You knew the guy next to you had just done the same 12 hours you did. You knew he was tired. You knew he probably lived alone. You knew he was going to go back to a boarding house room and try to sleep while the rest of the world was being loud outside his window. You knew because you were doing the same thing. So you sat together. That was enough. Some mornings someone would say something funny. Some mornings someone would pay for your eggs because you were short on cash. And next week you would do the same for him. Some mornings someone would just look like he was having a bad day and you would sit next to him instead of leaving a stool between you. Little things. We took care of each other in little ways. I think that kept some of us alive. The interviewer asked if any of those men became close friends. Carl said yes. He said there was a guy named Pete who worked the same shift. They started sitting together every morning. Then they started walking home together. Then Pete mentioned he lived 2 blocks from Carl. Then they started alternating. 1 week Carl would come to Pete's room. 1 week Pete would come to Carl's room. They would talk for a while, then sleep, then wake up in the afternoon and figure out how to spend the evening before the next shift. Carl said it took 6 months before anything physical happened. He said it was not planned. They were just sitting on the bed in Pete's room, talking, and Pete said something that made Carl laugh, and Carl reached over to shove Pete's shoulder, and Pete caught his wrist. And they looked at each other, and Pete said, "Are you sure?" And Carl said yes. And that was it. Carl said they were together for 11 years. He said they never lived together officially, too risky, but they spent every day together. He said Pete was the only person who ever really knew him. He said when Pete died in 1965, Carl went to the funeral and sat in the back, and no one knew who he was. Pete's family had no idea Pete had a partner. They thought Pete lived alone. They thought Pete was a bachelor who just never met the right girl. Carl said he did not correct them. He said it would not have helped. He said he just sat there and listened to them talk about Pete like they knew him when they did not know him at all. He said after the funeral he went back to Pete's room. Pete's sister had the key and let him in because Carl said he was a work friend helping clean things out. He said he took 1 photograph and one of Pete's shirts. He said Pete's sister threw out everything else. She donated Pete's clothes. She sold Pete's furniture. She had no idea she was erasing 11 years of someone's life. Carl said he kept the photograph and the shirt for the rest of his life. He said he never had another relationship. He said he did not want to. He said Pete was it. The interviewer asked if Carl had any regrets. Carl said yes. He said he wished they could have lived together openly. He said he wished they could have gone to dinner like a normal couple. He said he wished he could have held Pete's hand on the street without fear. He said he wished Pete's family had known because Pete deserved to be remembered correctly. Then Carl said, "But we had what we had, and what we had was real. No one can take that from me. I was loved. I loved someone. That is more than a lot of people get. I am grateful for it." Carl Bittner died in 2004. He was 80 years old. He left his papers to the Detroit LGBT archives. The photograph of Pete is in the collection. Pete's full name was Peter Antonelli, born 1922, died 1965. He was 43 years old. The factories had rhythms, hiring booms and layoffs, busy seasons and slow seasons, contract negotiations and strikes. The rhythm shaped everything. When the plants were hiring, the city filled up. When the plants laid people off, the city emptied out. When the union struck, everything stopped. The UAW strike of 1945-46 was one of the longest in Detroit history. Over 100,000 workers walked off the job, demanding higher wages and better conditions. The strike lasted 113 days. The city ground to a halt. The factories went silent. Men picketed in the cold, walking circles with signs, trying to stay warm. During strikes, money disappeared. No work meant no pay. Savings ran out fast. Men who had rented rooms could not make rent. Boarding houses evicted them. Some men went home to their families until the strike ended. Some men stayed, surviving on union relief funds and charity. The strikes were also social events. Picket lines became gathering places. Men who worked different shifts, who might never see each other normally, were suddenly spending hours together, walking in circles. Friendships formed, networks expanded. Solidarity was built not in speeches, but in shared cold, shared hunger, shared cigarettes. The picket lines were also surveilled. Company security took photographs. They noted who was talking to whom. They built files. After the strike ended, some men found themselves transferred to different shifts or different plants, or just quietly fired months later. The company had long memories. But during the strike itself, there was a strange kind of freedom. No one was working, so no one had anything to lose by being seen together. You could stand next to someone on the picket line for hours. You could go get coffee together after. You could sit in a diner and talk about the strike, the union, the company, life. No one questioned it. You were union brothers. That was the story. And it was true, even if it was not the whole truth. Some relationships started during strikes. The boredom, the cold, the shared adversity. It broke down walls. Men talked to each other who would not have talked otherwise. Some of those conversations led to something more. One letter survives from the 1945-46 strike. It was written by a man who signed it only as D. It was sent to someone whose name is not on the letter. The envelope is lost. The letter itself was found in an estate sale in 1998 and donated to the Walter P. Reuther Library. It is dated January 3rd, 1946. It says, "I know we said we would be careful. I know this is risky. But I keep thinking about Tuesday night after the picket. We walked back to your place and we talked until the sun came up. I have not talked to anyone like that in my whole life. I did not know I could. You asked me questions no one has ever asked. You listened to my answers like they mattered. When you fell asleep on the couch and I covered you with your coat, I wanted to stay. I wanted to wake up and still be there. I wanted this stupid strike to last forever, so I would have an excuse to keep seeing you every day. I know that is a terrible thing to want. People are struggling, people are hungry, but I cannot help it. This is the happiest I have been in years. I do not want it to end. When we go back to work, we will be on different shifts again. We will not see each other. I do not know how to make this work when the strike is over. I do not even know if you want to make this work. Maybe Tuesday was just Tuesday for you. Maybe I am reading too much into it. But I had to write this down because if I do not tell you, I will regret it. So here it is. I want more Tuesdays. I want as many as I can get. If you do too, leave the light on in your window tonight. I will walk past at 11. If the light is on, I will knock. If it is off, I will understand. No hard feelings. We can still be picket line friends. But I hope the light is on. Yours, D. We do not know if the light was on. We do not know what happened to D or the person he wrote to. The letter survives. That is all. The bathhouses were part of the infrastructure. They were not exclusively gay spaces. Plenty of straight men used them too, especially factory workers who lived in boarding houses without private baths. You paid your quarter. You got a towel and a locker. You showered or soaked or sat in the steam room. Perfectly innocent. Except certain bathhouses, certain floors, certain rooms. Those were known. The attendants knew. They worked on tips, and they knew who tipped well, and they knew what those men were there for. They looked the other way. They did not ask questions. They did not interrupt. The bathhouse on East Adams had been operating since the 1920s. It was a 3-story building with a legitimate public bath on the first floor, private rooms on the second floor, and a steam room and massage area on the third floor. The third floor was where things happened. You went upstairs, you paid an extra $1, you got access. The lighting was dim. The rooms had doors, but no locks. You understood the system. Door open meant come in. Door closed meant occupied. You moved quietly. You did not speak. Eye contact and body language communicated everything. The bathhouse raids happened periodically. The police would storm in, arrest everyone they found, charge them with public indecency. The raids made headlines. The bathhouse would close for a few months. Then it would reopen under new management, usually the same owner under a different name. And everything continued as before. The men who went to the bathhouse understood the risk. You could be arrested. Your name could end up in the paper. You could lose everything. But the need for connection, for touch, for physical intimacy, it was stronger than fear. The historian George Chauncey, in his landmark work on gay New York, documented how bathhouses functioned as both sexual spaces and social spaces. Men went not just for sex, but for community, to see familiar faces, to feel less alone. The bathhouse was one of the few places where you could exist openly, where you did not have to pretend, where everyone else there was in the same boat. Detroit's bathhouses served the same function. The attendant knew your face. The regulars nodded when you came in. You were recognized. That mattered. In a world that insisted you did not exist, or that you were sick, or that you were criminal, the bathhouse said you are real, you are here, you are not alone. Some men went weekly, some went daily. Some went when the loneliness became unbearable. Some went because they were married and had no other outlet. Some went because they were closeted and needed to feel something real, even if only for an hour. The danger was constant. In 1948, the East Adams bathhouse was raided on a Saturday night. 47 men were arrested. All of their names were published in the Detroit Times on Monday morning. 3 of them attempted suicide within the week. 1 succeeded. His name was Richard Crawford. He was 31 years old. He worked as an accountant for General Motors. He lived in a small apartment in Dearborn with his wife and infant daughter. He was arrested at the bathhouse Saturday night. His name appeared in the paper Monday. He went to work Monday morning, and his boss called him into the office and fired him. He went home. His wife had already seen the paper. She had already called her parents. They were coming to take her and the baby. She did not let him explain. He wrote a letter. He apologized. He said he had tried to be normal. He said he could not do it anymore. He went to the garage, closed the door, started the car. His wife found him 2 hours later. The letter was entered into evidence when the coroner ruled the death a suicide. The letter was not published, but it is in the Wayne County records. It is 8 pages long. It is one of the most heartbreaking documents in the archive. He apologizes over and over. He says he knows he is a disappointment. He says he thought getting married would fix him. He says it did not. He says he tried. He says he is sorry. He says he loves his daughter. He says she will be better off without him. He says he hopes his wife will tell their daughter he was a good man. He was 31. He had freckles. His wife thought he was working late when he went to the bathhouse. His daughter never knew him. She would have been 58 years old in 2004, when the records were digitized and made available to researchers. We do not know if she ever read her father's letter. We do not know if she knows. Richard Crawford was one of 47 men arrested that night. Most of the others survived. They lost their jobs. They lost their families. They started over, or they tried to. Some left Michigan. Some stayed and rebuilt. Some disappeared into new identities, and the bathhouse reopened 6 months later under a new name. The factories eventually integrated, slowly and under legal pressure. Black workers, who had been limited to foundry jobs and janitorial work, began to be hired for assembly line positions in the late 1940s. The integration was resisted violently by some white workers. Hate strikes broke out. White workers walking off the job to protest black workers being promoted. The UAW leadership officially opposed the hate strikes, but many local unions supported them. The racism and the homophobia were not separate systems. They were interlocking. Black queer workers faced double jeopardy. They were targeted for being black and targeted for being queer. The gay spaces in Detroit were largely segregated. White gay men went to white bars. Black gay men went to black bars. The two worlds rarely overlapped, but in the factories, they worked side by side. A black riveter and a white bucker had to trust each other to stay alive. A black welder and a white inspector had to communicate. The work demanded cooperation, even when the culture demanded separation. Some interracial friendships formed despite the danger. Some became more than friendships. The penalties were severe. A black man caught with a white man faced not just sodomy charges, but potential lynching. A white man caught with a black man faced social ostracism, job loss, and violence. But it happened anyway. One name preserved in the oral histories is William Turner. He was a black auto worker who moved to Detroit from Mississippi in 1942. He worked at the Highland Park plant. He was open about his sexuality within the black community, but closeted at work. In an interview recorded in 1985, he talked about the intersections of race and sexuality in wartime Detroit. He said, "If you were black and queer, you learned to be invisible twice over. You could not go to the white gay bars even if you wanted to. They would not let you in. You could not be too open in the black community because the church was everything, and the church said it was a sin. You could not trust white people because they might turn on you. You could not always trust black people because respectability, politics, meant you were an embarrassment. So you found your people where you could. House parties, rent parties, certain corners after dark. We took care of each other because no one else would." William said he had a white lover for a brief period in 1944. They met at the factory. They never went out in public together. They only met in private, in a rented room that neither of them lived in, paid for by the week. He said it lasted 3 months. He said it ended when his lover's family started asking questions about why he was spending so much time away from home. He said they never saw each other again after that. He said he did not blame him. He said the danger was too great. William Turner lived until 1989. He was 67 when he died. He was one of the founding members of the Detroit chapter of the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays, established in 1978. He spent his later years advocating for queer people of color. He said in his final interview that he wished the young people today understood what it cost to survive back then. He said he wished they knew the names of the people who did not survive. He said history kept erasing them, and he was trying to write them back in before he ran out of time. The letters that survive are fragments. Most were destroyed. The men who wrote them knew they were dangerous. They burned them, tore them up, hid them so well they were never found. The ones that survived, found in attics, in storage units, in estate sales, are accidents of history. Someone died and a relative did not go through the boxes carefully. Someone moved and left things behind. Someone kept them for 50 years and then finally decided they should be preserved. The University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library has a collection called the Detroit LGBT Ephemera Collection. It includes letters, photographs, bar coasters, event flyers, anything that documents queer life in Detroit. Most of the items are from the 1970s onward, but there are a few pieces from the 1940s. A photograph of 2 men in work clothes standing outside a factory, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling. No names on the back. A postcard sent from Windsor to Detroit, signed only with an initial. A ticket stub from a play at the Cass Theatre, dated 1947, with a note written on the back. "Best night of my life. Thank you for asking me." These fragments are all we have. They are not enough to reconstruct full lives, but they prove the lives existed. They prove love existed. They prove joy existed, even in the margins, even in the danger. The idea of coming out did not exist yet. The language had not been invented. You were not closeted because you had not chosen to come out. You were simply living the only way you could live. The notion that you owed the world an explanation for who you were, that you had a responsibility to be visible, that your silence was complicity. Those ideas came later, after Stonewall, after the movement began. In the 1940s, survival was the goal. You survived by being invisible. You survived by keeping secrets. You survived by trusting only a few people. You survived by having exit strategies, backup plans, alibis. You survived by being very, very careful. And sometimes you survived by finding one person you did not have to be careful with. one person who knew, one person you could be honest with, one person who saw you and loved you anyway. That was the victory. Not parades, not pride, not public recognition, just one other person who knew your real name. The work itself had a rhythm you could lose yourself in. The repetitive motion of the rivet gun, the steady arc of the welding torch, the careful placement of parts into the jig. You did the same motion 10,000 times a shift. Your body learned it so well you stopped thinking about it. Your hands knew what to do. Your mind could wander. That wandering was dangerous if you were not careful. You thought about things you should not think about. You replayed conversations. You remembered the way someone looked at you. You planned what you might say the next time you saw him. You imagined scenarios that would never happen. You built entire futures in your head, while your hands built bombers. And then the whistle blew and the shift ended and you clocked out and walked into the cold Detroit night, and reality reasserted itself. You were just another factory worker in a sea of factory workers. You were anonymous. You were nobody. You went back to your boarding house room and tried to sleep and failed because your mind would not stop. Some men drank to quiet the mind. The bars were full of men drinking alone, nursing beers until closing time. Some men worked double shifts to exhaust themselves into sleep. Some men walked the city for hours, mile after mile, until their legs gave out. Some men found other ways to cope. The drugs were not widespread yet, not the way they would be in later decades, but they were there. Benzodrine, pep pills, kept you awake on long shifts. Some men took them recreationally. They made you feel electric, invincible, like you could do anything. They also made you talk too much, trust too easily, take risks you would not normally take. Coming down was brutal. You crashed hard, fell into a depression that could last days. Some men used alcohol, some used pills, some used sex. Anonymous, frequent, compulsive. The bathhouse every night, the park every night. Cruising until you found someone, anyone, just to feel something. The psychiatrists called it self-destructive behavior. They said it was evidence of the underlying pathology. They said homosexuals were incapable of stable relationships, incapable of real love, driven only by compulsion and shame. The psychiatric literature of the 1940s is full of case studies describing gay men as fundamentally broken. What the psychiatrists did not understand, or did not care to understand, was that the behavior they pathologized was a rational response to impossible circumstances. If you are told your entire life that you are sick, criminal, damned, if you are denied any possibility of a normal relationship, if you have to hide every real feeling you have, if you live in constant fear of exposure, yes, you develop coping mechanisms. Some of them are healthy, some are not, but they are survival strategies, not symptoms of disease. The men who found stable relationships, who built lives together despite everything, were not exceptions proving the rule. They were proof that the rule was wrong. One such relationship is documented in a series of letters preserved at the Kinsey Institute in Indiana. The letters were written between 1943 and 1962 by two men who met at the Willow Run plant. Their names were Joseph Hartley and Martin Keene. The letters were donated to the Kinsey Institute in 1995 by Martin's niece, who found them after Martin died. Joseph and Martin met on the assembly line in June 1943. They worked different sections, but crossed paths during breaks. They started talking. They became friends. By September, they were more than friends. Joseph rented a small house in Ypsilanti, near the plant. Martin moved in as his roommate in October. They lived together for 19 years. The letters cover the periods when one of them was traveling. Joseph visited his family in Pennsylvania every Christmas. Martin occasionally went to see his sister in Ohio. The letters are not explicitly sexual, but they are unmistakably love letters. They talk about missing each other. They talk about what they will do when they are reunited. They talk about the house, the garden they planted, the dog they adopted, the routines of domestic life. A letter from Joseph to Martin, dated December 23, 1948. The train was delayed in Pittsburgh, so I will not make it home until the 26th. I am sorry. I know you were counting on having Christmas together. I was too. My mother asked again why I do not bring a nice girl home to meet the family. I told her I am too busy with work. She does not believe me, but she has stopped pushing. I think she knows, in the way mothers know things they do not want to admit. My father does not ask. He just wants to know when I am coming back to help with the farm. I told him I am not. Detroit is home now. He did not argue. I think he is relieved. One less mouth to feed. I miss you. I miss the house. I miss waking up next to you. I miss the way you hum when you make coffee. I miss the dog. I even miss the leaky faucet in the kitchen that you keep saying you will fix and never do. 3 more days and I will be home. I am counting the hours. Yours always, Joe. A letter from Martin to Joseph, dated December 24th, 1948. The house is too quiet without you. I fixed the faucet. It took me 10 minutes. You are going to be annoyed that I did it without you because you have been using it as an excuse to avoid other chores. The dog misses you. He keeps sleeping on your side of the bed. I let him because it makes me feel less alone. I went to the Anchor this morning after my shift, and Eddie was there. He asked where you were. I told him Pennsylvania visiting family. He said, give Joe my regards. I think Eddie knows. I think half the morning crowd knows. No one has said anything directly, but there is a way they look at us. Not hostile, just knowing. It is strange to be seen. I am not sure I like it, but I do not hate it either. Anyway, come home safe. I will pick you up at the station. I am making pot roast for dinner the night you get back. The good pot roast with the carrots you like. Hurry home. I love you. M. The letters continue for 14 years. They document a life. Arguments about money, plans to buy a car, repairs to the house, Martin's promotion at the plant, Joseph's struggle with back pain, the death of the dog and the adoption of a new one. Visits from Martin's sister, who apparently knew and approved. A health scare in 1955 when Joseph had pneumonia and Martin took 2 weeks off work to care for him. The last letter is dated March 1962. Joseph wrote it from a hospital in Ann Arbor. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer. The letter is short. It says, "They say I have 6 months, maybe less. I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of leaving you alone. We have had 19 years. I wanted 50. I wanted to grow old with you. I wanted to sit on the porch when we were 70 and watch the sunset and remember when we were young and stupid and so in love we thought we could make it work despite everything. And we did make it work. That is the thing I am most proud of. We built a life. No one can take that from us. You made me happy. Every single day, even the hard days, you made me happy. I love you. I have loved you since the first time you smiled at me in the break room at Willow Run. I will love you until I stop breathing. And if there is anything after, I will love you there too. Do not be alone for too long after I am gone. Find someone. Be happy. You deserve that. Yours forever, Joe." Joseph died in May 1962. He was 41 years old. Martin attended the funeral. He was listed in the obituary as a friend. Joseph's family sold the house in Ypsilanti. Martin moved back to Detroit, to a boarding house near the old factory. He never had another relationship. He worked at the plant until he retired in 1978. He died in 1994. He was 73. Martin's niece said she found the letters in a box under his bed. She said she read them all in one sitting. She said she cried. She said she had no idea. She said her uncle never talked about his life. She said he was always just Uncle Martin, the quiet one who lived alone and worked at the factory. She said the letters changed everything. She said she understood him for the first time. She donated the letters because she thought they should be preserved. She said someone should know. She said they loved each other, and that should matter. The Kinsey Institute archived the letters. They are available to researchers. If you request them, You get a folder with photocopies. The originals are stored in climate-controlled conditions to preserve them. You sit in a quiet reading room and you read 93 letters written over 19 years between two men who loved each other in a time when their love was illegal. You read about pot roast and dogs and leaky faucets and hospital visits and ordinary life. You read about love as a daily practice, not a grand gesture. You read about two people taking care of each other, year after year, through boredom and illness and fear and joy. And you understand that this is what was stolen, not just the public recognition, not just the legal protections, but the ordinariness, the ability to be boring together, the ability to argue about household chores and make plans for the weekend and grow old side by side. That is what the laws took. That is what the culture denied. Joseph and Martin had it anyway. For 19 years, they had it. And then Joseph died, and Martin was erased from the story, reduced to a friend, and he spent the next 32 years alone. But the letters survived, and now we know. The factory unions were complicated spaces. The UAW fought hard for worker rights, wages, hours, safety conditions. They won contracts that made factory work survivable. They built a middle class. They changed American labor history. But the unions were also conservative institutions. They enforced a particular vision of masculinity. The union man was tough, straight, a breadwinner for his family. Weakness was suspect. Difference was suspect. The men who did not fit the mold learned to hide or learned to leave. Some locals were worse than others. The River Rouge local was known for being particularly hostile. If you were suspected of being gay, your fellow union members made your life hell. They sabotaged your work. They spread rumors. They made it clear you were not welcome. The union stewards did nothing. Sometimes they participated. Other locals were more tolerant. The Willow Run local had a reputation for looking the other way. The stewards enforced the contract and did not ask about your personal life. If you did your job, you were protected. That did not mean you were safe. You could still be harassed by individual members, but the official union position was indifference rather than hostility. The split mirrored the city. Some neighborhoods were safe, some were not. Some bars were raided, some were left alone. Some cops were brutal, some looked the other way. You learned to navigate. You learned which streets to avoid. You learned which buses to take. You learned where you could breathe. Geography mattered. Corktown was working-class Irish, Catholic, conservative. You did not hold hands in Corktown. Greektown was more chaotic, more transient, safer for anonymity. The Cass corridor was bohemian, full of artists and musicians and people who did not ask questions. Downtown near Grand Circus Park was cruisy after dark but dangerous, heavily policed, frequent arrests. The riverfront was industrial, empty at night, private but also isolated. If something happened to you there, no one would know. You built a mental map, safe spaces and dangerous spaces, times when you could relax and times when you had to be vigilant. The map changed constantly. A bar that was safe last month got raided this month. A park that was empty last week was full of undercover cops this week. You had to stay current. You had to listen to the rumors. You had to trust the network. The network was everything. Not formal, no organization, no membership list, just people who knew people. You heard about a new bar from a guy at work who heard it from a guy at the bathhouse who heard it from his roommate. You heard about a raid from someone who was there and managed to escape. You heard about a safe doctor from a friend who needed one and found one who did not judge. Information flowed through whispers. You did not write things down. You did not use phones, too easy to trace, too easy to wiretap. You talked in person, in low voices, in places where you would not be overheard. You developed codes. You learned to speak around the subject without naming it. You learned who you could trust and who you could not. The risk of betrayal was always there. Someone could pretend to be your friend and turn you in. Someone could seduce you and then blackmail you. Someone could testify against you to save themselves. It happened, not often, but enough. Enough to make you careful. Enough to make you paranoid. Most men did not betray each other. Most understood that survival depended on solidarity. You protected each other because you needed each other. But the fear of betrayal shaped everything. You held back. You did not tell the whole truth, even to people you cared about. You kept secrets within secrets. You prepared for the worst, and sometimes the worst happened, and you survived, or you did not. The end of the war changed things slowly and then all at once. In 1945, the factories were running full tilt. In 1946, the contracts were cancelled and the layoffs began. The men who had moved to Detroit for war work were suddenly unemployed. Some went home, some stayed and looked for other work. The city contracted, the boarding houses emptied, the bars lost customers, the social networks that had formed during the war frayed. Men who had been neighbours, co-workers, friends, they scattered. Some moved to other cities chasing work. Some got married and disappeared into suburban life. Some stayed in Detroit, but pulled back, became more cautious, less visible. The late 1940s were a strange time. The war was over, but the Cold War was beginning. The country was paranoid about communists, about spies, about internal enemies. The government launched investigations. The FBI compiled lists. The House Un-American Activities Committee held hearings. Anyone who did not conform was suspect. Homosexuals were labelled a security risk. The theory was that they could be blackmailed by foreign agents, so they could not be trusted with sensitive jobs. The federal government began purging gay employees. The State Department fired hundreds. The military discharged thousands. Private companies followed suit. If you were suspected of being gay, you lost your job. No due process, no appeal. The Lavender Scare, historians call it now. It ran parallel to the Red Scare. It destroyed lives. It drove people underground. It made the 1950s the most closeted, most repressive decade of the 20th century for queer people. Detroit felt it. The auto companies tightened their moral clauses. The police increased their raids. The newspapers published more names. The culture closed in. The men who had found each other during the war years, who had tasted possibility, who had built networks, who had loved openly within their small communities, they had to contract. They had to be more careful. They had to hide deeper. Some could not do it. Some broke under the pressure. Some left. Some died. But some stayed. Some held on. Some kept the networks alive, quietly, carefully, through the worst years. They kept the bars open. They kept the bathhouses running. They kept showing up. They refused to disappear. And when the culture shifted again in the 1960s, when the gay rights movement began, when Stonewall happened, and the marches started, and the younger generation demanded visibility, it was built on the networks that survived the 1950s, networks that were built in the 1940s, in factories, in boarding houses, in bars, in the margins. The Autoworkers were part of that foundation. Most of them never knew it. They just lived. They survived. They loved when they could. They built lives in the spaces they were allowed. They passed down knowledge to the next generation. They kept the community alive. One more oral history, this one recorded in 2002. The man's name was Leonard Kowalski, no relation to Mrs. Kowalski, as far as anyone knows. He was born in 1925. He worked at the Packard plant from 1943 to 1956 when the plant closed. He was 77 when he was interviewed. He said, "I am one of the last ones left. Everyone I knew from those days is gone. I am the only one still alive to tell the story. So I am going to tell it. We existed. We were there. We worked the lines. We built the bombers. We built the cars. We were your neighbors, your co-workers, your friends. You did not know, but we were there. We loved each other. We took care of each other. We survived. I want people to know that. I want young people today to know they are not the first. We were here first. We paved the road. We did not have pride parades. We did not have rights. We did not have anything except each other. But we had each other. And that was enough to keep going. So when you march, when you celebrate, when you live your life openly and proudly, remember us. Remember the ones who could not march. Remember the ones who died in silence. Remember the ones whose names were never written down. We were real. We mattered. Do not forget us. Leonard Kowalski died in 2006. He was 81 years old. His oral history is archived at Wayne State University. If you want to hear his voice, you can request the audio recording. He has a Detroit accent. He speaks slowly, carefully, like he is choosing each word. Sometimes he pauses for a long time. Sometimes his voice breaks. But he keeps talking. He tells the story. He names names when he remembers them. He describes the bars, the factories, the boarding houses. He talks about the men he loved. He talks about the ones who died. At the end of the interviewer asks if he has any regrets. He thinks for a long time. Then he says, "I regret that I could not save them all. I regret that some of them gave up. I regret that we had to live that way. But I do not regret my life. I do not regret the people I loved. I do not regret staying. Detroit was my home. Those men were my family. I would do it all again." The thing about assembly line work is that you leave a piece of yourself in every plane, every car, every object you help build. Your hands shape the metal. Your sweat is in the rivets. Your exhaustion is welded into the frame. The bombers that rolled off the Willow Run line and flew over Europe, they carried the labor of 42,000 workers, including the men who could not tell anyone who they really were. Some of those planes still exist. Museums preserve them. The Yankee Air Museum in Belleville, Michigan, has a restored B-24. You can walk through it. You can see the rivets, thousands of them, each one placed by hand, each one driven by a riveter and a bucker working in perfect sync. You can run your fingers over the aluminum skin and know that someone's hands were here first, 79 years ago, in a factory that no longer exists, during a war that is now just history. Maybe those hands belong to Jim Riley. Maybe Tom Klein bucked those rivets. Maybe Robert S. and Sam worked on this exact section before Sam shipped out and died in Germany. You will never know. The plane does not tell you. The museum placard does not mention them. History erased their names from everything except the court records and the arrest reports and the letters that survived by accident. But they were here. They built this. Their labor made this possible. And if you know where to look, if you know what you are looking for, you can see them. The factories are mostly gone now. Packard is ruins. Willow Run was partially demolished, partially converted to other uses. The main assembly building was saved at the last minute and turned into a museum, but most of the complex is gone. Dodge, Maine was demolished in 1981. River Rouge is still operating, barely, a shadow of what it was. Highland Park is mostly empty. The city that was built by the auto industry is still figuring out what it is now that the industry has left. The population that peaked at nearly 2 million in 1950 dropped below 700,000 by 2010. Whole neighborhoods are abandoned. The downtown is revitalizing slowly, but the neighborhoods where the auto workers lived, those are mostly gone, torn down or left to decay. The boarding houses are gone. The bars are gone. The bathhouse on East Adams is a parking lot now. The brass rail closed in 1979. The Anchor Bar became a Coney Island, then closed, then was demolished. Mrs. Kowalski's house on Martin Street was torn down in 1983 to make room for a freeway expansion that never happened. The lot is empty now. Grass and weeds. The YMCA on Witherell is still standing, but it is no longer a Y. It was converted to apartments in the 1990s. You can rent a studio there. The gym is gone. The pool is gone. The steam room where men met each other on quiet mornings is now someone's living room. Geography erases history. Buildings are torn down, and the stories they contained disappear. People die, and their memories die with them unless someone writes them down, records them, archives them. Most of the Autoworkers left nothing behind. No letters, no photographs, no documents. They lived carefully and they died quietly, and history moved on without them. But some traces remain. The oral histories, the letters in archives, the arrest records that named them against their will, the court documents that recorded their love as a crime, the newspaper articles that destroyed their lives, the fragments, and the people who remember, the nieces who found letters and donated them, the archivists who built collections, the historians who spent years tracking down sources, the filmmakers who recorded interviews, the activists who fought to preserve queer history when no one else cared. George Chauncey, Alan Berube, John D'Amelio, Lillian Faderman. These scholars spent decades documenting what had been hidden. They went through police records and court documents and personal papers. They interviewed the survivors. They built the archive that proves we existed. They gave us back our history. The Autoworkers are part of that history. They are not famous. They did not lead movements. They did not give speeches. They just lived. They worked 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered rent. They loved each other in rooms no one remembers. They survived when survival was not guaranteed. That survival created the possibility for everything that came after. The men who stayed in Detroit after the war, who kept the bars open, who kept the networks alive through the repressive 1950s, they handed something down. Not a manifesto, not a plan, just the knowledge that you were not alone, just the example of lives lived despite everything. When the younger generation started organizing in the 1960s, when the gay liberation movement began, they were not starting from nothing. They were building on networks that already existed. Networks built by men who met in factories, in boarding houses, in bars that opened at midnight and closed at dawn. Detroit's gay liberation movement officially began in 1970 when a group called the Detroit Gay Liberationists started meeting. They held consciousness-raising sessions. They organized protests. They demanded rights. The founders were mostly young, mostly college students, mostly people who had grown up after the war. But some of the older men showed up. Men in their 40s and 50s who had lived through the 1940s and 1950s. Men who had survived the raids and the arrests and the purges. They did not lead. They mostly sat in the back and listened. But they were there. And their presence said, "You are not the first. We tried too. We survived. Keep going." Leonard Kowalski was one of them. He attended meetings in the 1970s. He did not speak much, but he was there. Younger activists remembered him. They said he was always supportive, always encouraging, always willing to share his story if asked. They said he represented continuity. He was proof that the community had existed before Stonewall, before liberation, before pride. He was a living link to the hidden history. When he died in 2006, the Detroit LGBT community held a memorial. Over 100 people attended. Most of them had never met him. They came because they understood what he represented. They came to honor the generation that survived in silence so the next generation could speak. The memorial program included a quote from his oral history. "We were real. We mattered. Do not forget us. They have not forgotten." The Detroit LGBT archives exists because people decided the history was worth preserving. The oral history projects exist because people decided the stories needed to be recorded. The museum exhibits exist because people decided the lives mattered. In 2019, the Detroit Historical Museum opened an exhibit called Out in Detroit, LGBT History in the Motor City. It covered a century of queer history from the 1920s to the present. One section focused on the 1940s. It included photographs of the factories, maps of the neighborhoods, copies of arrest records, and excerpts from letters. It named names: Jim Riley, Tom Klein, Samuel Pritchard, Joseph Hartley, Martin Keene, Richard Crawford, William Turner, Leonard Kowalski. The exhibit was up for 6 months. Over 50,000 people saw it. The comment book was filled with responses. Some people wrote that they had no idea this history existed. Some wrote that they had known gay people must have existed in the 1940s, but had never seen it documented. Some wrote that they cried reading the letters. Some wrote that they were grateful someone had preserved this. One comment, written in shaky handwriting, said, "My uncle worked at Willow Run. He never married. He lived with his roommate for 30 years. I always wondered. Now I know. Thank you for telling his story." That is what this work does. It tells the stories that were not told. It names the people who were not named. It makes visible what was hidden. The auto workers in Detroit's factories in the 1940s were ordinary people living in extraordinary circumstances. They were caught between a culture that denied their existence and a desire to live fully, to love fully, to be known. Most of them made compromises. They hid when they had to. They lied when they had to. They pretended to be someone they were not in order to keep their jobs, their housing, their safety. But in the small spaces they carved out, in boarding house rooms, in bars that stayed open past closing, in letters written late at night, in moments stolen on break between shifts, they were honest. They were themselves. They told the truth. They loved. And that love was real. It was not pathological. It was not sick. It was not a phase or a confusion or a crime. It was love. As real as any love has ever been. As deep, as complicated, as ordinary. Joseph and Martin arguing about a leaky faucet. Robert S. keeping a photograph for 49 years. Paul writing a letter on his break, hoping the light would be on. Carl sitting in the back of a funeral for the man he loved, unable to claim him. Leonard refusing to forget, refusing to let history erase them. These are love stories. They are also survival stories. They are also resistance stories. Because living when the world tells you not to exist is resistance. Loving when the law says your love is criminal is resistance. Building a life in the face of erasure is resistance. The auto workers resisted. They did not have a movement. They did not have a plan. They just lived. And their living made it possible for the next generation to demand more, to demand recognition, to demand rights, to demand equality. We stand on their shoulders. Every openly gay person today, every person who can marry the person they love, every person who can live without fear. We owe a debt to the people who survived when survival was not guaranteed. The auto workers did not get to see the world we live in now. Most of them died before marriage equality. Most of them died before workplace protections. Most of them died believing that nothing would ever change, that the hiding and the fear and the secrecy would last forever. They were wrong. Things changed. slowly, too slowly. But they changed. And the reason they changed is because people refused to disappear. People like the Autoworkers who met in factories and boarding houses and bars. People who whispered their truth when they could not shout it. People who loved each other despite the law, despite the church, despite the culture that said they should not exist. They existed anyway, and their existence made ours possible. So tonight, when you think about Detroit in the 1940s, do not just think about the factories and the war and the industrial might of America. Think about the men who worked those lines. Think about the gay auto workers who built the bombers that won the war and then came home to a country that called them criminals. Think about Jim Riley and Tom Klein, arrested for loving each other, fired from their jobs, erased from history. Think about Sam Pritchard, who died in Germany at 22, and Robert S., who loved him for 50 years after. Think about Joseph and Martin, who had 19 years together and wrote letters full of pot roast and dogs and ordinary love. Think about Richard Crawford, who could not survive the shame, and the daughter who never knew him. Think about Leonard Kowalski, who lived to be 81 and spent his last years making sure no one forgot. They were real. They mattered. They shaped the city and the industry and the culture in ways that were never acknowledged. They loved and worked and survived in the margins. And the margins were where the future was being built. Every time you drive a car, remember that gay hands built it. Every time you see a restored B-24 in a museum, remember that gay hands riveted it together. Every time you walk through Detroit, if you ever do, and you see the ruins of the old factories, remember that gay men worked there, lived there, loved there. They are not forgotten, not anymore. We say their names, we tell their stories, we honor their survival. We continue their resistance by living openly, by refusing to hide, by building the world they could only dream of. And maybe, in some way we cannot measure, they know. Maybe Leonard Kowalski, wherever he is, knows that we remember. Maybe Joseph and Martin know that their letters survived, and people read them and understood what they meant to each other. Maybe Sam knows that Robert never forgot him. Maybe all of them, all the men whose names we know and the thousands whose names we do not. Maybe they know that we are still here, that we survived, that we are living the lives they could not live. We owe them that. We owe them our visibility, our pride, our refusal to be erased. We owe them our lives, lived fully and openly and without apology, because they lived carefully and quietly and in constant fear so that we might live differently. So if this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in a world where you can love who you love without being arrested, where you can be yourself without losing everything, spare a thought for the auto workers of Detroit in the 1940s. The ones who clocked in at midnight and worked till dawn. The ones who met in break rooms and boarding houses and bars. The ones who loved in secret and survived in silence. The ones who built the world that built the world we live in now. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other, and they had the courage to love anyway. That courage echoes forward through the decades. It reaches us here, now, tonight. We hear them. We remember them. We honor them by living. May your dreams be free of factory noise, police raids, and the fear of being yourself. May you sleep soundly knowing that the people who came before you fought for your right to exist. May you wake grateful for the ordinary miracle of safety, of love acknowledged, of a life lived openly. Good night and sleep well.